Hey guys, so I am hard at work producing the second part of this Mini Cooper build series. In fact, you guys can actually have a sneak preview of what that's gonna be about. But anyway, right now you guys are watching the extended cut version of part 1, which originally aired about 2 to 3 weeks ago. And in the extended cut version of any of the episode, obviously it's gonna be a little bit longer, and that's because I'm spending a lot more time showing you guys the technical details, explaining my thought process, and sharing, tech tips along the way. So if that sounds like your jam, then continue to look out for extended cut versions of all of the episodes. But, if that doesn't sound like your cup of tea, then, you can probably skip the extended cut versions. Anyway, to each their own. Hey guys, welcome to the first build of my new YouTube channel, Master of None. And in this build series, we have a budget of $3,000 to make this F57 Mini Cooper S the perfect daily driver. Let's go. Let me tell you a little bit about the car and what our plan is. This is an almost brand new, completely stock 2023 Mini Cooper S. Really the only thing that I've done so far is to add these racing stripes on the hood because, why would you have a Mini without racing stripes, right? So this is my fiance's daily driver, and I'll just say that she's not a car person. But when we were shopping for a new car, she just absolutely fell in love with how fun it was to drive and its unique design. And, I have to agree, it is a pretty good little hatchback as it is. It's surprisingly fuel efficient, pretty practical in getting around town, and with its B48 turbocharged engine, it's no slouch when you put it in sport mode and punch it. However, I do see a little bit of room for improvement, and like most cars, Minis have increasingly gotten away from their small, lightweight racing heritage and gotten bigger, fatter, softer, and cushier. And it's not the quietest interior, but everything from the road feel to the engine and the exhaust noise is pretty muted, so we're gonna make it just a bit more exciting. And like I mentioned, it is my fiance who's driving this car most of the time, so we don't want to make it so rough and raw that she's going to nag me to change it all back. Whoa! But we will tweak the suspension and give it a little bit more noise and power so it's more exciting when you want it to be. And of course, we're also going to try to make it look a little bit mean and menacing, although I admit the car looks pretty dang good in my opinion already. So we have a budget of around $3,000 to accomplish all this. And why $3,000? An upgrade to a John Cooper Works Mini would have been about $6,000, so I was mostly just wondering how much I could do with half the cost. And
this doesn't make any sense!
Yeah, I know, but hey, it's always more fun to build a car you want than to just write a check for it. So in this episode, we're going to go ahead and get started with the suspension, and in the next episode, we'll add a bit of noise and power, and on the third episode of this build, we'll tackle the aesthetics and creature comforts to build the perfect daily driver for my fiance. Just kidding. This is mostly for me, but maybe she won't notice. We're first going to install some performance springs, and here's the thing. Especially if you're working on a daily driver, oftentimes you don't have to spend a ton to get expensive coilover setups to get what you need. If you're just looking to lower the car a little bit to get a more aggressive stance and to improve handling without sacrificing too much ride quality, a good, nice set of lowering springs made from reputable brands like Dinan will do the trick just fine at fraction of the cost. These Dinan performance springs were made specifically for the F55, F56 Minis and designed to work with stock struts. And this will lower the car about an inch in the front and rear, which is perfect. And this should still leave enough clearance for speed bumps and driveways. So for the set of 4, the springs cost $225, which I thought was really good, until you realize that these are also basically needed. So Dinan makes a very heavy-handed recommendation to pair the springs with their supplemental ride quality handling kit, which are basically just shorter bump stops to account for the shorter springs. And these were $80, which honestly feels a little scammy. It is a lot to pay for some pieces of foam and rubber, and this kind of feels like a hidden fee for the springs. But you know what? They do say that you need them, so you know the total for now is $310, which, you know, I guess it's still not that much to pay to have sportier suspension. If you're working on your own Mini Cooper, here's the steps that I took to remove the strut assembly to replace the spring. I'm disconnecting the strut tower from the sway bar link by removing this nut right here. And a quick buzz from an impact wrench loosened it, and then I had to get a Torx bit to hold the ball joint in place while I took a box wrench to take off the nut completely. Then I loosened up the hub assembly, which clamps onto the strut tower. So you can just zap it with an impact wrench again, and then bolts should come out from the other side pretty easily, as long as it's not rusted stuck. By the way, I don't usually work on newer cars. My, usual jam is, junkers anywhere between 10 to 40 years old, but, this is pretty great working on a car that, Mother Nature isn't actively trying to reclaim. You'll also want to loosen up the top of the strut tower under the hood, while you'll find 3 bolts holding the strut assembly in place. So you'll just want to loosen them enough so that the strut tower can kind of wiggle around, but don't back out the bolts all the way. We'll do that later once the bottom of the strut tower is pulled out of the wheel hub. Speaking of which, so this is when things got a little bit tricky for me. So what you have to do is pull the strut tower out of this clamp area on the hub that you loosened earlier by pushing down on the hub at the same time you're pulling up on the strut assembly, but no amount of muscling, hammering, and swearing was getting the job done. And I tried using lubricant and all manners of percussive persuasions, but I couldn't get it to move more than an inch or so. After struggling with it for a while, I did figure it out, and I'll share the trick with you. So what I did was actually remove the steering tie rod end ball joint from the hub, which the internet said you didn't have to do, but it gave the hub even more freedom to move, so it helped me out. Also, this was easy enough anyway. Once I removed the nut from the ball joint, it just kind of fell out. Then I took a piece of 2x4, put it against the strut assembly, and jacked it up so that the strut assembly compressed at least a couple of inches. Then I took another piece of 2x4 and hammered the hub down until the strut popped out of the hub. It took me about 2 hours of struggling and forum researching to get this thing out, but once I figured out the best way, getting the strut out of the other side took me only about 20 minutes. By the way, don't be an idiot like me. Hold on to the strut assembly while you release it from the top, unless you like getting your toes smashed. Alright, so we're gonna do the other side, but this will be much more, let's say, proficient, since we learned a bunch of stuff. And I'll include some tips too, so you can do this in 20 minutes per side the first time you do it. So we'll start by removing the wheel, and at this point, if you want to squirt some lubricant in this area right here where the hub clamps to the strut, it does help with twisting this thing out later. We'll disconnect the sway bar link from the strut tower bracket. Be sure to have a box wrench and a Torx bit for this. Loosen the hub clamp that's holding the strut assembly in place and take out the bolt as well. Disconnect the steering tie rod and ball joint from the hub. And if there isn't much corrosion, it'll probably just drop out of there. Loosen the bolt from under the hood, but don't back them out all the way so that the strut can wiggle, but it won't drop. You can start hitting the top of the hub downwards to start to get some movement, but that probably won't be, enough. So you'll need to jack up the strut a few inches using a floor jack and a 2x4. But don't lift it so much that the car becomes unbalanced on your jack stands, because that's really dangerous. Just a few inches will do. And keep hitting the hub downwards using a mallet and another piece of 2x4, and when the assembly is about to release, you can just kind of wiggle it out. Hold the strut in place while you back out the top hat bolts, now this time all the way out, and there you go. The assembly is out. When you take out the strut, you'll notice that there's like a really thin paper gasket on the top hat, and I'm not exactly sure what this thing does, but assuming that it has some function, try not to rip it or forget to reinstall it. You'll also notice that the top of the strut has this nut that you need to loosen while using an Allen wrench to hold the top of the shock from rotating. And you're supposed to use a specialty tool for this, which is such a classic BMW thing, but I'll show you later why I don't think you'll even need it, because I didn't end up using it at all. So here are the strut assemblies out of the car. I'm going to give the top nuts just a quick zap with an impact wrench just to loosen them up a bit. I'm not backing them out all the way. The spring is under tension, and I would rather not risk a serious injury by taking a metal plate to the face. So to prevent that from happening, I'm going to compress the springs up with this toolkit before I remove the top nut completely, so that I can take off the top hat of the assembly. And you know, to be honest, I'm not actually sure if I needed to do this just to get the top hat off. Maybe it'll be just fine if you just kind of impact the top nut off without compressing the springs, but you know, this is a safety thing. I have the spring compressors on hand anyway, so I might as well just use them here. Now that the pressure is off of the top plate, I can safely back out the top nut off, and you can just do this with a regular socket and not the specialty tool that I was talking about earlier, which is kind of what I'm holding right now. It's basically an open side socket that allows the use of an Allen wrench, but again, I didn't have to use it for disassembly, and you'll see later that I didn't really need to use it for installation either, so if you don't have this already on hand, don't worry about it. I don't think you'll need it. And now I'm just going to pull out the rubber boot and the stock bump stop that was on the shock, and now that the spring is out of the assembly, you can see that the stock spring is taller than the new lowering springs that we purchased. And this makes sense. This isn't exactly rocket science, although I'm sure some fancy testing went into fine-tuning the spring rates. You can also see that the new bump stops that we got are shorter than the stock ones, so I'm guessing this allows more room for shock travel with the lowered springs. And the new one came with a rubber boot attached, but I went ahead and just tossed it since I don't get what it would accomplish sitting inside another rubber boot, which I will be reinstalling. Installation is pretty simple. Just put the new spring on, making sure that it's nestled correctly on the rubber pad on the perch, and then slide on the new bump stop and slide the rubber boot back on, which is connected to the top rubber pad, which also needs to be positioned correctly in relation to the spring. Once you got everything positioned correctly, and by the way, don't be nervous about this, it is pretty intuitive how everything goes back together since the stock spring will have left a pretty noticeable imprint on the rubber pads. And now you can just put the top hat back on and zap the top nut with an impact wrench to tighten everything up. Since the new springs are much shorter than the stock spring, I didn't really even need to use a spring compressor here to get the nut all the way down. And after that, I took out the little folds in the rubber boot, and there you go, it's ready for install. Installation is pretty simple, it's just the disassembly steps backwards. And you know, it's funny, when I first started seriously working on cars like 10 years ago, I used to look up the torque specs for each and every nut and bolt, and I still do that when I'm like building an engine or something, but when it comes to suspension, you kind of start to develop a good sense for, you know, roughly how tight everything needs to be. So I can't tell you the torque specs here, but I'm sure they're available online if you actually bother to look for them. One thing that I will note is that the strut assemblies are different for each side, but if you do mix them up accidentally while you're working on them, they are labeled L and R, so pay attention to that. The springs are interchangeable side to side, but not the strut assemblies when you're installing them, so just don't try to install the driver's side strut tower to the passenger side. That'll just be a giant waste of time. And just like that, the new springs on the front are on, and let's hope the back ones are just a bit easier. And they are. Things are much simpler back there. As with the front, we'll go ahead and remove the rear wheel, taking care, to not drop it on the brake dust shield this time. That hurt my soul just a little bit on the front. And then we'll jack up the rear hub so that as I disassemble, things don't just pop off, and we'll go ahead and disconnect the shock after it's been raised. And in classic BMW fashion, it doesn't use a standard bolt. I forget what these things are called. I think they're just called star or Torx bolts, but if you're working on a Mini or a BMW, make sure you have a set of these sockets and bits on hand. And then we'll go ahead and disconnect the rear sway bar. And this is the same deal as with the front. You have to use a Torx bit to hold the ball joint in place while you use a box wrench to get the nut off. And then you can release the jack to lower things back down, and if you step on the brake rotor and press down, you'll get enough clearance to pull the rear spring out from where it's nestled. The rubber pad should come out with the stock spring, which you'll use again on the new spring. The new spring with a rubber pad installed on it can now go in its place. The rubber pad does need to go in a specific orientation so that the little nub on it can neatly fit into the perch. But no need to worry about this, it is pretty obvious when you get a close look at things in person. And then the installation is just uninstallation backwards, right? As you jack up the hub again, make sure that the sway bar ball joint fits back into the hole. Tighten it back up to roughly the right torque spec. Use the jack to get the bottom of the rear shock to align back up with its bolt hole, and tighten that back up too. And that's pretty much it. This whole thing should take you less than 30 minutes per side in the rear, given that you have the right tools. And this is about as simple as it gets when it comes to spring replacements. This was really pretty simple. Now we'll go ahead and lower the car with all the wheels back on, and as much as I want to admire my work right away, we're going to take it out for a spin because the new springs need to settle, and then we'll take a proper measurement to see how much it actually got lowered. After about a 30-minute drive, I parked the car and I measured that the front was now sitting at 25 inches from floor to top of the fender, which is a full inch lower than stock, or when I measured it before. And this is about a quarter inch lower than advertised, but I'm not too concerned about it since it was even on both sides, and the quarter inch probably came from the slightly heavier engine of the S trim of the F57. And the rear is now sitting at 25 1/4, which is exactly 3/4 of an inch lower than before as advertised. And taking a step back and looking at things, the Mini does look much better with the suspension a little bit lowered, but there is still something that seems off to me, and I think it's how the wheels are recessed into the wheel well, which is now even more pronounced now that the car is lowered. I think the Mini could look even better with the wheels sitting more flush with the fender edge. And I really thought about buying wheels that have more of a negative offset to accomplish this, but that would basically blow my entire budget, so I decided to go with these. And I know everybody loves to hate them and doubt them, but here they are. These are wheel spacers made by ECS Tuning, and these are 12.5mm in the front and 15mm in the back. These are high-quality, hub-centric wheel spacers that should be just thick enough to give us a little better wheel fitment. And, just based on the marketing, it's possible that they give the car, better handling characteristics, but really, that's not why most people buy these. People buy them to either get better aesthetic fitment like me, or to clear a big brake hit, or to fit thicker tires. They also come with extended wheel bolts as a kit to ensure proper and safe installation, and these were $265 total for everything. Pretty expensive, but I guess not as expensive as a set of all new wheels and tires. While I'm installing these, I did want to talk about some common misconceptions about wheel spacers that really bug me. So number one, no, you do not need an alignment after installing these. If you actually stop and think about it, they don't actually change any alignment angles like lowering or raising your car would. Number two, no, they are not dangerous to use as long as you don't go crazy with the thickness and everything is installed properly. And of course, this is given that you buy quality parts from a reputable brand. I'm not making any guarantees if you decide to save a few bucks on eBay. And number three, no, they don't destroy your wheel bearings any more than a wheel set with more negative offset would. And this obviously depends on how thick the wheel spacer is, but as long as you don't go crazy with them, wheel spacers of 10 to 20mm won't make a meaningful difference in the lifespan of your wheel bearings. Anyway, sorry about that little rant. After I got them installed in all four corners, we can now admire how the new springs and the wheel spacers came together. and I think it's fantastic. After driving around for a while, I'm just loving the setup. Just driving it down the road, it really is as comfortable as the stock suspension, and it doesn't feel all that different even if the road is a little bit bumpy, but when you take a hard corner, they do feel different, and in a very good way. It feels firmer and more controlled, which is what I was looking for. And of course, the looks. I think it looks awesome, just with an inch lower and the wheels just a bit more flush with the fenders. And I'm satisfied with this, and I think this is well worth the first $500 of this build. And doing all this for $500, that's awesome, because we still have plenty of budget to play around with. In the next episode, we'll tackle even more exciting stuff, like giving the engine a little bit more juice and making it sound a little angrier when you step on the gas. Cool, I think that's it for this episode. So, if you're someone who also watched the original shorter version of this episode, what did you think of the extended cut? Was this worth a watch? Was it helpful or at least interesting? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you guys soon again with the second part of this build. See you soon.